Welcome back. As we mentioned, Labor Day marks the start of the home stretch of the presidential campaign. And it comes as new polling shows a potentially widening gender gap. A new ABC News Ipsos poll taken after the Democratic convention has Vice President Harris up 13 points among women. Meanwhile, Trump leads by 5 points among men. That's an 18-point gender gap. Joining me now on set is my NBC News colleague, Ali Vitale. Also with me is Svante Myrick, former Democratic mayor of Ithaca, New York, and president and CEO of People for the American Way, and also Mark Short, former chief of staff to Vice President Mike Pence and an NBC News contributor. So I want to first start with you, Ali, because you, of course, wrote a book on women being elected. So what do you make of this 18-point gender gap?
It's huge. And typically the thing that struck me is that gender gaps are typically driven over the years by men becoming more conservative, white women reliably. And people were surprised at this for some reason in 2016 and 2020 when they saw the ways that President Trump was able to earn the majority of white women. Some people were like, wait, what? Hillary's on the ballot? No, that's not the way that this works. But what strikes me in this new polling is that we're watching the gender gap change because white women might be shifting the way that they are thinking about voting. It's really early, but when we think about the role that women in the suburbs specifically could play again, we watched them build part of the key coalition for President Biden in 2020. And now President Trump has to either figure out how to talk to these people, which I really don't think he's going to be able to do, given the way that their issue set is around democracy, small d, and then, of course, abortion and reproductive access, or he risks losing them. And the Harris team is aware that they need them, and they are more than happy to welcome them with open arms.
I wonder if I could stick with you for a minute to just talk about the way that Vice President Harris is talking about this. She's a history-making candidate, and I keep thinking about the fact that her mom told her, and she talked about this at her speech, show them who you are, don't let them tell you who you are. She's showing people I'm a history-making candidate, talking about her family, but she's not talking about it directly in the way that, say, a Hillary Clinton did.
We show up how we show up. Right? It's true in every single job that you could have. Everyone knows that Vice President Kamala Harris is historic. I think the way that they're not talking about it is really important because it almost speaks to a thing that might not be a motivator for either reluctant Republicans who might not be too enthused with Trump, but still want to see that there's an alternative. Mark knows this so well. Identity politics on the right, it's a bad word. You don't talk about it. And so if you're trying to appeal to those kinds of voters, simply not saying the thing might be enough to just say, hey, listen, I'm not here to talk about that I'm qualified, that I'm here as a woman, I'm here as a person of color. No, I'm qualified. I want to do this job. Here's what I want to do with it. And that's the focus, clearly.
Yeah. And Mark, according to the pollster, white women have actually moved closer to Harris since the convention, while white men are moving closer to Donald Trump at that same time. How far do you think former President Trump can go by only winning that demographic?
I don't think you can. I think you have to win over the female vote. And I think that, in 2016, Hillary Clinton was a history-making candidate as well, but she clearly had a personality that wasn't as appealing to many female voters. I think that the challenge for the Trump campaign is that I think there's an opportunity to win over those voters if you're talking about economic issues, if you're talking about Kamala Harris's economic plan, if you're talking about safety in your communities. But unfortunately, I think this campaign's been run so much on personality attacks that's probably less appealing to suburban women voters.
Yeah. And I want to ask you, when you think about the idea that this is still a close race, but the Harris campaign with the money and with the organization, they're still calling themselves the underdog campaign. Do you think they really believe that? Or do you think that this is sort of messaging to get their base, Democrats who might be feeling really good, still motivated and not feeling like they got this?
I actually do believe that the Harris campaign is an underdog. Men are 47-0 in presidential elections, and it's not because we deserve it, just to be honest.
Amen.
Right? There is a strain of misogyny in our country that is real. Besides that, of course, she's running against a world-famous billionaire who has been president before, who survived an assassination attempt and has an enormous money-making machine behind him, right? We all know Donald Trump, but if you strip away that name, if you just say that, a world-famous billionaire is your opponent who's been president before, yeah, you just might be the underdog. And you add on top of that, of course, the rank unfairness of the Electoral College, the fact that people's votes don't count the same, right? In America, everybody's vote should have the same weight. It doesn't. And the Electoral College means that if Democrats are going to win, they probably have to win the popular vote by 3 to 4%, right? So unless she's up by 6% in the polls, she might be behind or tied. it is smart to recognize that Democrats still, in this election, despite all the energy, the charisma, and the professionalism of the person at the top of the ticket, Vice President Kamala Harris, we are still the underdogs.
Yeah. When you put it that way, it makes sense if you think about it, if you take the name out and say he was the president and is a billionaire. That being said, Ali, I want to play for you some of Kristen, of course, the moderator of Meet the Press, Kristen's exchange with Senator Tom Cotton on the issue of federally funding IVF. Let's take a listen.
Just very quickly, do you know where this money would come from to cover IVF? Because in 2022, some $8 billion were paid by.
Well, no, again, that's why I say we'd have to evaluate any specific legislation.
So you wouldn't
that I do
support
on any specific.
dollars.
I'd have to evaluate any specific legislation as I would on any legislation.
So you're still undecided on where you stand on this government-funded IVF plan.
Well, I certainly support couples having access to IVF, and it's not even a controversial issue in any of the 50 states.
It was definitely a controversial issue in Alabama, but setting that aside, I wonder, are Republicans where most Republicans, Ali, where Tom Cotton is when it comes to liking IVF but not knowing whether or not they want to federally fund it?
First of all, you can always just say Kristen. She's like the Madonna or Cher of politics, especially at this table. But we were actually having this conversation outside, the idea of where Republicans are on IVF and how this issue has changed over the decades. And what I was pointing to outside is this idea that in Alabama, when they revived this idea of an embryo, which is so central to the IVF conversation because it's literally how you are storing these fetuses, it's a question of conception. It's a question of where the Republican Party is on that. It's still a live issue, frankly, when you talk to a lot of these other Republican lawmakers. So yes, I do believe that Republicans by and large support IVF as a way to expand your family, but like the technical mechanism of it, I still think is unsettled within the party.
Mark, what do you make of this idea of federally funding IVF?
I think it's one more example of how lost our party is today on financial issues. We have a top candidate who said he's not going to touch entitlement spending. We have $35 trillion in debt. Our presidential nominee says he's going to put a cap on drug prices. Now we're going to pay for IVF funding. I mean, you can't out-Democrat Democrats. I mean, they're the ones that want to use taxpayer dollars to fund everything. And somehow if we're trying to compete with that, that's a losing strategy. We're not offering an alternative, Yamiche.
What about there was all this back and forth about sort of where Trump stands on abortion, especially the measure in Florida. Are you feeling a degree of whiplash here?
I think there's been enormous whiplash. I mean, I think that he's separated from the people in the administration who actually were pro-life. He's reverted back to his traditional pro-abortion positions. And I think there's been a consistent step back, whether or not that's, basically saying I'm for chemical abortions, or not that's saying it's up to the states. If you're basically saying you're okay with abortions in California and New York, and you're okay with chemical abortions, the number of lives you're actually trying to protect is actually a very small percentage. And so the president has walked away from those pro-life positions.
How do you see this issue?
Well, I truly believe, probably for the first time in my adult life, that it's very easy to be a Democrat right now. That we are actually the more organized, professional political party. Republicans were famous for being in array while we were in disarray. But now it turns out that there is something wonderfully useful about a coalition that comes up with a platform together and holds that platform together through rules, through legislation, and through process. So that when the emperor has no clothes, right, when President Biden is clearly a bit too aged to serve another 4 years, the party can do something about it. President Trump has transformed the Republican Party into a cult of personality, including the Republican platform, which just said that they passed at the RNC, just said, whatever Trump says, we like. So now activists who've worked their whole life to pass a federal prohibition on abortion are now being forced to support a candidate that doesn't want that.
Yeah, well, thank you so much. We could talk about this for a while, but thank you so much to all of you. And still to come, roughly 10,000 hotel workers walk off the job this Labor Day weekend. What's next for negotiations? That's after the break. You're watching Meet the Press now. Welcome back. As people across the country celebrate Labor Day today with barbecues and pool parties, NBC's Zingle Asamoah has more on the history of this federal holiday. Take a look.
Today, work looks a lot different.
How would you describe the workplace now versus, say, what it was like a few decades ago?
A buyer's market versus a seller's market.
Johnny Taylor is president and CEO of the Society of Human Resources Management.
Back in the day, employers, if you will, bought talent. And so it was very much up to the employer to determine the terms and conditions of employment. Fast forward, in a knowledge-based economy, everyone now understands that they sell their talents and their skills to organizations.
The seller, in this case, the American worker, is celebrated on Labor Day. Put simply,
Labor Day, in some ways, for many decades, was closely tied to labor unions in the United States, right? Especially up to the 1950s, 60s.
At the time, union membership was defined by craft unions or guilds. Think skilled workers, carpenters, plumbers, and electricians.
It's very much not connected to labor unions anymore, which have declined in membership, really since the 1970s. That image of the guy in a sort of steel-toed boots and a hard hat, mostly that doesn't exist.
Today, just over 11% of American workers are in unions, down from a high of over 30% in the 1950s. So how did we all end up getting the day off? Quick history lesson.
Labor Day officially became a national holiday in 1894 in legislation signed by then President Grover Cleveland. Now, there's some dispute over which labor leader first proposed the idea to kind of strike one day a year. And then some state governments over the course of the 1880s started recognizing this as Labor Day.
But the way we work has drastically changed. According to Pew Research Center, today, 14% of employees are fully remote. That's compared to 5.7% who worked from home in 2019 prior to the COVID pandemic. And the length of time spent in careers is changing too. Workers under 34 years old are on average switching careers every 1.3 years. That's compared to older employees switching every 4.9 years.
Why have we seen these changes?
Number one would be demographics. American birth rate's been on a decline.
Translation, fewer workers and more demand.
The second and perhaps most important reason is just the nature of business in a knowledge-based economy.
And then there was COVID. The nation reached a 20-year high quit rate following the pandemic.
The organizations who are going to win are the ones who get the right people and keep those people, keep them motivated. And so employers have to be far more focused now on how we treat our employees.
Our thanks to Zinkley for that reporting. Meanwhile, thousands of hotel workers walked off the job on this Labor Day weekend after contract negotiations with some of the country's biggest hotel chains stalled. NBC News' Antonia Hilton is following it all from Greenwich, Connecticut. So, Antonia, how long will this strike last?
Hey, Yamish. Well, this strike right here in Greenwich, Connecticut is likely going to last at least one more day. But really, it's part of potential rolling strikes that could spread to other cities very soon, and as in a matter of just a couple days. What these workers are asking for are higher wages, better health care, and better work schedules and opportunities. Some of the people here have worked for the Hyatt chain, where I am in Greenwich, Connecticut, for 10, 25, 30 years. Some of them saying that their raises in recent years have only looked like 25, 30 cents on the dollar. And they are struggling to pay their rent and pay their basic bills at the end of the month. And so that's the fundamental concern here. And they're hoping that the pressure on this Labor Day is going to bring these major hotels back to the table so they can get a new contract done, Yamish.
Well, as you talk about the hotels possibly coming back to the table, is there any sign that this strike is yielding any progress toward the workers' goals here?
Well, I can tell you, I spoke to a travel expert who told me that he thinks it's very likely that coming out of this holiday weekend, that these brands are going to be feeling some of that pressure to raise the wages at least and to take a look at new contracts for these workers. And that's because this is just one holiday. We have a bunch of other ones coming just a few weeks, coming up in November, then in December. And those brands, they can't really afford to not have their full staff, their cooks, the housekeepers working at these hotels as people start to travel at the busy end of year season, Yamish.
Yeah, and I just wonder, as you stand there, are you feeling the sort of energy of these workers? What's your feeling on just sort of how they're feeling?
Absolutely. There's a lot of energy here. We've been here the last 2 days. People laugh. At times they have even cried to us, talking about what their lives are like. Just to give you a snapshot, I spoke with one worker who has been with the Hyatt for 25 years. His most recent raise a few years ago was only 30 cents. And he has kids. He's struggling to pay for their colleges. He's struggling to pay his bills. And that's what it's like here.
Yeah. Antonio Hilton, thank you so much for bringing us that news straight from, of course, that picket line there. And I'm back tomorrow with more Meet the Press. Now, the news continues right now with Hallie Jackson.
Thanks for watching. Stay updated about breaking news and top stories on the NBC News app or follow us on social media.